Jump forward then a little bit. So the Marseille Tarot is a set of tarot cards that emerged in France during the late 1500s going into the early 1600s. And so they had become canonised, if you understand that word, so they became a tradition of a sequence. Now that sequence had been referred to in other documents that had been found previously, in terms of people that had made reference, and there had been verbal references to the sequencing of these cards, and this was coming out of northern Italy. But we have quite a huge gap between the point at which the cards first started to emerge in northern Italy during the 1400s and when they turn up in France during the 1500s and 1600s. So this set of cards here are the Visconti cards, and these are pretty typical of the cards that emerged in Italy during the 1400s. So playing cards themselves actually didn't turn up in Italy until sort of the end of the 14th century, the beginning of the 15th century. And so, but they took off really quickly in terms of a card game. And in fact, they were just used for playing cards or for carrying around paintings in miniature. That's literally, and if you get a chance later on, feel free to open this and have a look at them, and you'll see they're gold-leafed and they were beautiful in terms of what was being created. But underneath this, there was the rudiments and the foundation to a deep spiritual philosophy. And in my book, I referred to these cards as portable stained glass windows. And that's literally what the whole thesis of my book is about, is the idea that in fact the original tarot was an attempt to salvage some very, very core teachings of Christianity that the Cathar perceived had been bastardised, excuse the English, by the Catholic Church at that particular time. Now, when we get to, this is 1700, Dodale's work, it comes out in 1701, and it's sort of got this comic book characterisation to it. So the cards go from being pieces of art now to nearly comic books, like portable comic books. But so it's not being appreciated for art so much as being a message, as being a deep teaching. And it's in the 1700s that the cards start being used for divining purposes. So it's really quite late before they're being used for divining. Now, cartomancy existed for a long time. Cartomancy was the regular packs of playing cards that were being used to do readings. Now, that wasn't too unfamiliar. Up until cards emerged, they used dice. And they would use 3 dice. Interestingly enough, the combination of 3 dice is 56, which is exactly the same as the Minor Arcana in the tarot cards or the playing cards. And so, but these would be used for gambling, but there was some of the priests had found a holier purpose for the dice, and they literally created a whole set of meanings for these combinations that were spiritual, that were religious. And so you would go away and you would contemplate what the meaning was that you got from the throw of the dice for that day. And there had been, I've got a photo when I walked the Camino de Santiago. I was in I've forgotten the name of the city at the top, but there's a Templar castle there, and they've got a museum in there, and there's a beautiful hand copy of a manuscript that had all of the 56 combinations of the dice with their meaning written on them, which is a photo in one of my books, and in this book you'll see a photo of it in there. So they were using these for a spiritual divining purpose, but you know, if it was being used for that, it was being used for other things as well. But certainly by the time we get to the middle of the 18th century, by 1750, tarot reading was now popular and had really sort of caught on. But up until then, there was very little tarot reading as such. And so the whole notion of the cards being the book of the devil started long before tarot reading. It was because it was associated with Gnostic Christianity. Okay? So it was this idea of a version of Christianity that wasn't Catholic Christianity, and that's what made it evil, was this whole idea. Now the Cathars, who's not familiar with the Cathars? Okay, a few. So the Cathars essentially were a religious group that were inspired by the Manichaean and Bogomils that came out of the Eastern Bloc and made their way into Western Europe. And there were a whole lot of splinter groups of Gnostic Christians that emerged, and the Cathars were one group that emerged that were predominantly centred in Languedoc. Languedoc means the language of Oc or Dioc, which is how they said yes in southern France. Is that right? You don't know that? Oh, so that literally means this is the language of Dioc. So these people in this region speak yes in this way, and that's how they defined France, was how you said yes. And the different regions were defined by how they said yes. And so here we have the Cathars are in this region of southern France, Arles, Narbonne, all that region through Carcassonne, Toulouse, all that area through there. It was very rich, and the religion grew very quickly, and so much so that it began to frighten the church. And they were concerned about the fact that the nobles were aligning themselves with these people, and instead of paying tithes to Rome, they were now supporting these people. And so the Dominicans were sent in, the Franciscans were sent in, and there were major debates. They would literally, the Cathars, they would have these debates about theology in the squares, and they would see how many they could win over. And one of the things that we got was that Cathars were intelligentsia. They had books, they had manuscripts, they studied, they weren't ignorant people, and they could debate with the Dominican priests and with the Franciscans. Wasn't enough to convert them, so Pope Innocent III initiated the crusade, the Albigensian Crusade in 1209. And basically between 1209 and 1229, they systematically went through southern France and literally wiped out whole communities. They couldn't financially sustain it, so in about 1232, I think it was, they began the Inquisition, very different to the Spanish Inquisition. It was mainly against Jews and Moors, whereas the Inquisition in southern France was primarily against the Cathars, the Waldenesians, some of these other sort of religions that were heretical by nature. By 1350, they had wiped out all of the Cathars in southern France and northern Italy. What happened was, as they were being exterminated out of southern France, they made their way along the Pyrenees, because they were pretty safe in the Pyrenees, and eventually then made their way into northern Italy and ended up in Milan. The reason that they ended up in Milan is that the Visconti, who were basically running Milan at this particular point, had been excommunicated by the Catholic Church. And so they weren't, and in fact the head of the Inquisition for the church was actually in Milan. And yet here we have this whole city that had been excommunicated. More than a city, it was all the region. At this stage, the Visconti were quite established. The Visconti were champions of the Holy Roman Emperor and Florence. They were called the Ghibellines, and the Guelphs were associated with the Florentines, and they supported the Pope. And so what we had were these two political groups, one group that was supporting the Holy Roman Emperor, who came out of Germany. It was generally the Emperor of Germany who became the Holy Roman Emperor, and then we have the rest who were supporting the Pope, and these were two areas of conflict. So the last of the Cathars are executed during 1350, prior to cards coming into Europe. So the Cathars knew nothing about cards, but they certainly would have had manuscripts. They didn't have churches. Anybody here been to Europe and been through the churches in Europe, the cathedrals? You go through and they're just, the walls are plastered in iconography, Christian iconography. That's how people learnt, was through symbols and the language of art on the walls. And that's why I call the cards portable stained glass windows, because it was an attempt to take the teachings of the Cathar who'd been exterminated and carry them on in a community that didn't meet in churches. These were people who met in fields and in homes, and they didn't believe. And the reason they didn't believe in churches was because the material world was the world of Satan, as far as they were concerned. It was the world of the evil god. And so investing in churches was investing in Satan, as far as they were concerned. So they're gone. We don't know, and here's the piece of history that I can't absolutely put the finger on. We don't know who carried on the tradition. We can imagine that the prominent Cathars were wiped out, but you know that there was an underground movement that would have existed, and we know that there were lots of companionships, as they were referred to, that existed, that were underground movements that literally carried on deep spiritual traditions away from the Catholic Church, so that they weren't going to be attacked by the Church as such. So what the whole theory of my book is proposing is that the Marseille Tarot became a very... it's quite bizarre to think that something so exposed could carry such deep, profound secrets. To hide something in plain sight is how I describe it, and they did it successfully. So what I've managed to do is, in my journey, unlock the deep mysteries. Now, I don't want this to sound like I've, sort of done a Da Vinci Code, but I'm going to tell you I've done a Da Vinci Code. In that, what had been going on in my personal life became an opportunity for me to see things that, if I hadn't been a Mormon, if I hadn't gone through the things I'd gone through, I wouldn't have seen. So I'm in Italy, and I have a set of cards, and I have one book, reference book, with me, and that's it. And I sit down and I start really sitting with the cards and the symbolism. And card number one, and I don't need to use this because I've bought this. Card number one is the Magician. Okay? And I'm looking at the Magician, and all of a sudden his hat just about comes off the page in 3D to me. And all of a sudden I'm looking at this Oribus snake that I had been drawing for years previously in his hat. And I'm thinking, hang on a second, there's something in this that people are missing in terms of its significance. And then as I continued to look through the cards, I then realised that force or strength had the same shape hat. And all of a sudden I'm thinking, oh, hang on a second. There's something going on here that's more than is there's a message in this. And over a period of a couple of weeks, I continued to play with this, and then the penny dropped. Is that these two cards basically were saying, this is the key for unlocking the mystery of the majors of the Marseille Tarot. This has nothing to do with the minors. By the way, the 22 picture cards, if you're not familiar, they had nothing to do with the minors. They were complete. The minors were just playing cards. These were introduced as trump cards much later on. There is a lot of evidence to suggest it was to avoid paying 2 lots of entertainment tax. People have been avoiding tax for a very long time, but if you played cards, the ace of spades had to be franked by the taxman, which is why the Ace of Spades still has all of the stuff on them when you get a pack of cards. And if you weren't franked, you could go to jail for not having paid entertainment tax. So to avoid paying 2 lots of taxes, it's believed that they actually combined the major arcana and the minors, so they only had to pay 1 lot of tax. Pretty clever. Okay, so we've got these 2 cards. Now here's what was interesting, is have a look at the number on this card here up the top. Number 1, of which there are 10 cards until we get to number 11, of which there are 10 cards until we get to card number 21, which is the World card. And of course we have one other card in these 22 cards who doesn't have a number, and he's the Fool. Okay, so he doesn't have a stationary position, which means he's on the move the whole time. And so he's not a place, he's an experience, and he's every man, every woman. He is you and I. He represents us on a journey, on a pilgrimage. And in fact, that's who he is. He's a pilgrim. So I'm thinking, okay, well, what we know about the Visconti, and they had a lot to do with this, is that they could talk about Greek mythology and Christianity in the same breath. And 1 minute, one of the Francesco Maria Visconti, he's named after Maria, is Mary. He's named after Mary. And then his first name is not Francesco, his first name's after Macedonian god. And so they would mix up these Christian and Greek metaphors all the time. And so Greek mythology was an intrinsic part of the whole tradition of the Visconti. They saw themselves fully aligned with this Greek mythology, but they were also Christians. I think they were sort of placing a bet both ways, making sure that they could get to heaven maybe. And so I began to play with the notion that maybe what we could be doing is looking at these cards representing Greek tradition or mythology. And so the magician, of course, was associated with, do you know who the magician was in Greek or Roman mythology? Mercury, yes, Hermes, who's the same thing as Mercury. He was the magician, but he was also, do you know, in addition to being the magician, what he was? Sorry? Do you know what other role, primary role? He had 2 others that he was known for. Sorry. Both the Egyptian one was. No. He was renowned to do about sex. So huge. Oftentimes the symbol for Hermes would be a penis with wings on it, and so it was very, very sexually oriented. And he was also the guide for travellers. So I'm thinking, hang on a second, we've got a magician, we've got a pilgrim, and he's a guide for travellers. In my book, when I was living in Italy, I went to a beautiful museum in Naples and came across this statue. If I can find it very quickly. There's a photo of it in my book here. This is about 6 foot tall.
Where was this? Sorry, in Naples?
This is in Naples, yes. It's a phallus. And of course it's Hermes. And in fact, these were called Herms. H-E-R-M-S, short for Hermes. And they would be found at an intersection. Now, you can imagine there weren't many intersections in Europe at that time. There weren't that many roads going to places, but in the middle of this intersection, not in the middle of it, probably off to the side, could be in the middle, would be this huge phallus. And written on the 4 corners or 4 edges of it would be the names of the villages of where you're going. they got a little bit more sophisticated later on. They would build Hermes, and it would be sort of like a rectangular sort of brickwork, and it'd have a statue of Hermes' head, but it would have a penis and testicles carved into the front of it. And then it'd be sitting there. Well, eventually when the Christians took over, they all went and they were just crosses were put at the intersection. So they sort of transformed with time very, very quickly. So I'm thinking, hang on a second, maybe he's at an intersection. Maybe this is actually Hermes, the magician, at an intersection. Where's there an intersection? And so we go back and have a look at his hat, and we think, hang on a second, in the lemniscate, in that figure 8, the lazy 8 on its side, there's an intersection right in the middle. And I started to go with the whole notion, maybe these two are on opposite sides of an intersection. Now, if any of you are familiar, does anyone know who the goddess of intersections was? Hecate. She was the goddess of intersections. The interesting thing about intersections, does anyone know why intersections, what significance they held in medieval Europe, early medieval Europe, and even in earlier times? These were liminal spaces. So fences, intersections, doorways, gateways were liminal places, and they were the place where heaven and earth, or the other world and earth, were really close. And so if they wanted to get rid of somebody that was bad, they would chop their head off and bury them at an intersection so that they would go across to the other side really quickly.
Mercury was actually, he would carry the souls on the river of death.
Absolutely. Had a whole lot of other... Absolutely. There was so much about these characters, just which I write about some of that stuff in the book. Okay, so I'm thinking, okay, intersection. Do we have an intersection? Well, yes, we do. And yeah, just hold those two for me. We have the remnants of two overlapping circles. So in other words, if I was to extend this, I could have a circle here and I could have a circle here. And that's what I then started to play with, was this idea. So what I ended up doing was putting this in the centre. And then I'll explain why I ended up putting them the way that I did, but I then ended up placing these two cards here. Card 1 and card 10, with the idea that the next 9 cards would complete half of the lemniscate. So what we end up with what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to turn it side on. Yeah.
We can use that.
No, I'll just turn it side on. This will be fine.
Yeah.
I'll just swap those two around again. Okay. So we go down here. Thank you. We go down here, we go down there. We go there. We place this here, and here, and here, and here, and here. So all of a sudden, the relationships in the cards completely change, because up until now, because of the number sequencing, people go from left to right. And so all of a sudden, the magician would be looking this way, and then the popess would be looking back this way, but back towards the magician, where in fact she's looking away from the magician. They're both looking in the same direction. And now we have the mother, the empress, looking back there, and now we're coming back. We've got these other dynamics of relationship taking place. And it completely changes the whole meaning of the cards the minute they're placed in this situation. So let's talk about this, and as I said, we don't have a lot of time this afternoon, but I'm going to touch on where I went with this. So, does anyone know what the Italians would call that shape?
Vesica Pisces?
Well, no, they wouldn't have called it a Vesica Pisces, but that's the name that it took on. What's almond? Mandorla. So this is a mandorla. It's an almond shape. And that was associated with the Vesica Pisces. So this is the sacred yoni, so as to speak. And what sits on the other side of the sacred yoni, in the Cathar tradition, was the world of the good God. They had no idea what that looked like. They have no idea what the world of the good God looks like, other than the fact that, and Joseph Campbell uses a really great word to describe it, undifferentiated consciousness. The idea of a consciousness where there is no separation, all there is one. And for them, they perceived that all there was undifferentiated consciousness, and the way that you got there was to drink from the Holy Grail, because they were the custodians of the Grail, and that would allow you to partake of the fruit of the tree of everlasting life, the tree of life. That's all they knew.
Because that is part of the flower of life shape too, the Vesica Pisces. Yeah, I can see that.
So all of a sudden, we've sort of, when we start then to look at the Cathar theology, they were dualists. So they believed in the idea that there were two worlds. There was the world of the good God and the world of the evil God. The world of the evil God was anything to do with differentiation. The minute that there was something that wasn't God, that was the world of the evil God. And so, as far as they were concerned, the journey was how to get from having differentiated and to return back to the sacred yoni, to enter back in through the yoni of the Divine Mother. And so this literally became their description for that sacred journey in terms of what would happen. So the point at which Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, we're going to use that story here, they partake of the fruit, and what happens? In that moment, they are now perceiving themselves to be differentiated. They're naked, they're afraid, they've become self-driven in their motive for choosing to eat. They've now taken on their own will versus divine will. So they've now acted in a way that creates differentiation. Now, the scripture says something interesting. It says, God says, now you've become one of us to know right and wrong, good from evil. So this is interesting because God's alluding to the idea, now you understand what isn't God. But then God goes on to say, which is an us by the way, he says, now you've become one of us. It's not just a God, it's a us God, but as part of this whole. You can't hang around here anymore because you can't partake of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of life, everlasting life, because you're fear-based. And I'm actually doing you a favour by kicking you out of here because you don't want to partake of this fruit and spend the rest of your life living in fear. So I'm going to put you into this imaginary world. It's an illusion. It's not real. And during this imaginary world, you're going to get to find out how to overcome or replace fear with love. And once you've got that, then you can enter back through the sacred yoni. But you've got to pass 2 tests before you can get back in. Does anyone know what the 2 tests were? Any of you Bible scholars? I'm going to put a flaming sword and a cherub or a cherubim at the eastern gate. Now, how many of you, well, let me just back up. If God's saying to get back into heaven, you've got to be able to pass the test of the flaming sword and the cherubim, how important do you think that is? You'd think that'd be pretty important, wouldn't you? If this is what God said, this is how you're going to get back in here, is to pass these tests. How many of you went to sermons where the priest said, today I'm going to talk about the test for getting back into heaven? Flaming sword and cherubim. Does anyone know what the test of the flaming sword is and how to pass it? No. Any of you? No. Unless you read my book. That's the whole thing. Anyone know what the test of the cherubim is? Does anyone know what a cherubim looks like? Ezekiel did. Guess what it was? It was one being that had 4 faces. And what were on the faces? Oh, just lost my microphone. I put it in my pocket. A bull, a lion, an eagle and an angel. These were the 4 faces that were on Ezekiel's cherubim. So, interestingly enough, a cherubim does exist in the course of this, and here it is here. It's actually the flag that's sitting, or the standard that's sitting at the end of the trumpet. That's the test of the cherubim. Have you been able to bring the 4 into its highest expression, which is divine consciousness, or in the Christian context, Christ consciousness? I want to make it really clear, the Cathars saw Jesus as a prophet or an exemplar, not a saviour. They saw Christ as the saviour, not Jesus. And so they were able to differentiate very clearly between the two. And they didn't see Jesus as the saviour. Now, one of the things that most people don't recognise, look at what's in the left hand of the devil. He's got a sword on fire. The Cathar understood the test of the flaming sword and the test of the cherubim. Nobody has ever explained the flaming sword in any of the literature that I've read in tarot world around why the devil's holding a flaming sword. We're going to get there in a minute and tell you a little bit about why he's holding a flaming sword. But it's the test. In other words, part of the journey of being able to come back into wholeness is you passing those 2 tests. The test of the flaming sword and the test of the cherubim. Okay,
so
yes?
Are those tests very specific, or are they, in all sorts of examples? I mean, of our lives, or do you wait till you die until you see?
No. You can pass those tests while you're alive.
That's what I mean. So we're not going to meet somebody holding a flaming sword, are we? And say, or...
Yep, you're going to be holding the flaming sword.
Right.
In fact, and you have to carry out what the flaming sword is asking of you,
Right.
which is to sacrifice your child.
Oh.
That's what Abraham was passing the test of the flaming sword. He was asked to sacrifice his own child. Hold that and we'll come to it. Don't go anywhere with it, because it's actually quite exciting, really. I can tell you were starting to go, ooh, beep, beep, beep. No, hang in there. Okay, so here's what happens. We leave the Garden of Eden, we pass through the sacred yoni, and we're now in differentiated consciousness, and we're experiencing, the bull represents matter, physical. The angel represents air, mind. The lion represents desire, passion, motive, spirit. And the eagle is associated, it's a water element, and is associated with the element of water and emotion. So all of a sudden we're now in a place where we're experiencing differentiation, represented by desire, feelings, thoughts, and experience, some form of experience that's more physical as such. We're not human yet, by the way. This is an in-between world. And one of the people we meet there is the magician. And the magician says, and what is he? He's a guide to the traveller. He says, you're a pilgrim, you're about to go on a journey into human consciousness. And you're going to get to experience 4 things. Primarily, the 2 things that are going to really, excuse the French, fuck you up, is power, which is the wand, because that's what wands are about, was power, and money. You guys are going to get really screwed around by power and money. However, you are going to deal with issues of the heart, cups and daggers. And he said, and these are the things that are going to become part of the illusion. These things have nothing to do with the world of the good God. This is all part of the illusion. So he's letting us know right from the outset what you're about to deal with. Then we have the Popess. There's a whole chapter dedicated to the concept of a Popess and the emergence of the feminine outside of the Catholic Church. In fact, a Popess had been anointed by the people under the control of the Visconti, and it was actually his cousin, Matteo Visconti, who was the head of the Viscontis at that time. His cousin, who was a woman, she was a nun, had been appointed as the first Popess. The Inquisition got her and burnt her at the stake. It didn't last for very long. Anyway, she's there and she's looking through a veil. If you have a look at that picture, there's a curtain behind her. And it's a veil that separates this middle world from earth. And so she's with whoever's in the spirit world, which is you and I. And of course, the Cathars were reincarnationists. So they were of the opinion that you got to pass this way many times. And in fact, on her lap is the Book of Life that talks about all the things that you've been learning. But by golly, you're only halfway through the book. If you have a look, there's a few more times that you're going to be coming around this way. This time she's saying this is what you're going to be dealing with. And she's alluding to who your parents are going to be, and she's looking at the mother. And so here we have the Empress, and she's the mother. And we know that this is the mother because there's some wings down here next to her buttock. And that's called a zigzag of effulgence. Once again, I'd like to think I'm the first person to have actually identified historically this as a fact. There's a few people contesting me in the tarot community, but I'm pretty conclusive what my evidence supports otherwise. And you'll see some drawings from where you would see people sitting on thrones and they'd have this zigzag coming out of their bottoms. And it was called the zigzag of effulgence. And this is about the birth of the fool for Christ. So it's about the pilgrim being born with the potential of Christ within him or her. And this is about the mother giving birth. What's interesting, around her head, there's really nothing that separates her from other than the veil. And so it's nearly like the mother has a connection with the spirit world. There's this innate connection that women have by virtue of the fact that she's a mother that entitles her to have this sensitive connection to what's on the other side of the veil. And that becomes part of what sort of supports her in her role. But once we get beyond the head, there's a very thick throne there which represents dogma and tradition and structure and form. And of course that's the whole idea of the shield, and the shield has this emerging eagle on it, which is once again this symbol of the emerging fool, and she's nurturing. Of course, what's happening here is the 7-year-old is being established in their programming. So this is the programming that's taking place in the formative years of the child. And it's within a shield, which means that there's a whole set of structure and form around it that's saying that the potential, this is an immature bird that's drawn in these cards, the potential is massive, but it's locked down. And of course, by the time we get to the Emperor, not only is there all this sort of the bird's established, it's got itself well and truly clearly identified who it is, it's got a really strong framework around it. Look at where it is in terms of the father. Look where his foot is. It's sitting on it, sort of saying, I'm in control here. I've set what the rules are. You've been programmed, but I'm telling you where the parameters are, well and truly. And so now the fool has been completely programmed by the mother and the father in terms of their human experience. And now what's interesting, in all of the early cards, This card has a number 4 written up here. These cards were done in 1983, came out of Spain. A quick story about this. I knew about these cards and I couldn't buy them in Australia, and I wanted to get some when I was walking the Camino. And so I'm dressed in my Camino gear and I'm in Logroño. And I go into a bar and I say to the people in the bar, is there somewhere where I can buy tarot cards? Well, that was not the right thing to ask a Christian-based country that supported the Camino, which was about a journey for Catholics and experience with God, asking about tarot cards. Well, the guy behind the bar tells everyone in the bar that this pilgrim has asked for tarot. He walks around with a broom, puts it under his legs and starts running around the bar like he's a witch on a broom, taking the piss out of me because I was wanting to buy tarot cards. Anyway, I did manage to get the tarot cards, but I paid the price for asking the question. So anyway, so there's a 4 there. Have a look at the shape of his legs. They're in the shape of a 4. And this is really now about the establishment of the 4, the bull, the lion, the eagle and the angel, in the place of human consciousness. The emperor represents power. Now this is going to be a trick question. What do you think the Pope represented and we're talking the end of the 14th century going into the 15th century, what do you think the Pope represented? Wealth. The church was all about accumulating wealth. And so now we've got the wand, power, the coin, wealth, represented by the church. And then, so these are all of the things that distract us from the centre. This is we're reaching the bottom. We haven't got to the bottom, we'll get to the bottom in a minute. But we're getting there. And then we've got the lovers. Now, this is, once again, I've given a new interpretation on this in just recent times to the tarot community, and some people are going, oh my God. So, if any of you are familiar with C.S. Lewis, do you know what he wrote? Alice in Wonderland? Amongst other things, he wrote a book called 4 Loves. This represents the 3 loves that distract us from divine love. Eros, which is romantic love. Philia, which is compassion, empathy and family love, and affection, which is friendship and that deep friendship. Basically, this was, before it was called the lovers, it was called the loves. And these are the loves that distract us from agape, which is actually what's needed to enter back through the sacred yoni. And so here we have the 3 loves being depicted in this card that become the distractions to us and the fool as we're going through. Now you kind of think, well, how does empathy and affection and romance interfere with those things? Well, it means that what we're not centred on is divine-like love, even when we're focusing on those things. And it's a whole different language. And then we've got success or fame, the Chariot. And so power, wealth, love and success or fame become the 4 distractions. That's the 4 of the leg that's shown by the Emperor. He's saying these are the 4 things that are going to distract you most from your deep spiritual journey. And of course, this is the Chariot, represents the victor's chariot. If anyone had a chance to go to the Il Palio in any of the cities in Italy, in Siena, they have twice a year a big horse race called the Il Palio. And in the horse race, the winner gets to ride the chariot. And of course, this goes back to the ancient battle tradition of when you won a battle, you would go into the city that you became victor over, that you won over, and you would ride the chariot through as the victor. And so this is the symbol of success. And of course, interestingly enough, he has palindromes on his shoulders, who is his mother and father, who are directing everything that he does by virtue of his programming. Now, here's what they were teaching. If you're buying into the world of illusion, then you're also buying 3 other things that are going to impact on your life. Anytime you buy into those 3 things, these 3 things exist. One is natural justice. I loved it when I lived in Italy. There was you could go to the shops and buy this donut.